If you want to learn more about the topics of today's episode, visit the podcast website at naturesecretservice.com. Thanks for listening. Okay, people, listen up. Here we go. This is Nature's Secret Service, the podcast that puts you in the room with the men and women of wildlife law enforcement. I'm your host, Ed Newcomer, and today our guest is Erin Dean, former special agent with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and super good friend of mine. Erin Dean, thanks for being on the show.
Sure. Nice to be here, Ed.
You sound a little reluctant.
You know, these are not my favorite things to do.
Yeah, you always say that, but you're actually really good at being telling our story and being a spokesperson for the Fish and Wildlife Service. So,
well, I used to get paid to do this.
That's true. I'm not paying you, am I?
No.
Darn it.
It's all favors.
Well, you know, Erin, you and I, we worked together for a long time. I don't think it's any secret. You're my all-time favorite agent.
Thanks, Ed.
You have a long background in the Fish and Wildlife Service. You, like Marie Palladini, who was on the show before in this season, you came on with the service fairly young, right? Soon after college?
Yes. In fact, I graduated from college at University of Wyoming and literally the next day left for Washington, D.C. to start my career with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And
what was that first job you had? Because it was with law enforcement, but not as a sworn officer, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
Yes.
What was that first job?
It was a secretary. Yeah.
No kidding.
Yeah.
But it was, ironically, if I remember right, it was for special ops, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
Yes. I started out working for some of the greats from Fish and Wildlife Service. Dick Marks, Rick Leach, George Morrison.
Right. Classic.
Yes.
Heroes of the service. Yeah,
absolutely.
For sure.
Yeah.
That must have been crazy to go straight from college to working, not just in, Fish and Wildlife Service law enforcement, but at the Special Operations Unit where they were doing a lot of long-term kind of hardcore undercover stuff.
Yeah, I was pretty naive, quite honestly, Ed. After I graduated from college and growing up in Wyoming, I really didn't know anything about U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And when I was getting ready to graduate and I didn't have a job, and I called and I said, hey, is there anything that I could do in D.C.? Mm-hmm. And he said, well, there's this one glamorous position.
As a secretary.
As a secretary. And I said, well, it sounds great. I really didn't know what I was going to do, and thought maybe I'd go back to school and maybe go to law school or something like that. And so I took it, and I fell in love with the agency. It was really pretty exciting as a 22-year-old going back and being kind of dumped into the Special Operations Unit where all those agents work deep undercover cases. And it was pretty fun.
Pretty cool. And here you got to see like their reports and see how they prepared for trial and all those different things that they do. And it gave you a real early, kind of intro into the world of law enforcement, which is cool.
Exactly. I always laugh and joke that I was a professional Xeroxer. I prepared prosecution notebooks and looked at their reports and listened to their tapes and their undercover tapes and stuff like that. It was...
Yeah, you got to see all the crazy background stuff that nobody talks about on TV shows or anything, because it's the boring part of law enforcement. It's the writing up the reports, and it's preparing, as you said, trial notebooks for assistant U.S. attorneys to review and look at and get ready to go to trial. All of that's not very sexy, never gets included in the TV shows.
No, for sure. But it gave me a good look at what agents in the Fish and Wildlife did, and it was very exciting to me. And so I decided to stick around.
But you kind of had a affinity for law enforcement going way back, right? If I remember right, from when we were agents together, you told me a story once that shocked me because it was so similar to my childhood. You had, I don't know how old you were, 10, somewhere in there, you tell me, but you had like a detective agency with your friend, right?
Yes, with my cousin. Yes, we were private investigators, and we had our files. And I believe I was badge number 0167. I remember that to this day. Random
number?
Just a random number. She was 0166.
Nice.
And we did our investigations throughout the neighborhood. And
how old were you then?
I was probably 10. Yeah.
I remember when you told me that story, I don't know where we were, lunch or just in the conference room, but it struck me because I had the exact same experience at about that same age, 10, 11, 12. Me and a friend of mine, we had our own detective agency, in air quotes. We even went so far back then, at the back of a comic book, you used to be able to, there was always like these little junk things you could order that were either advertisements in the back of comic books. And one day we found these special investigator wallet badges that you could buy for, a couple dollars. We ordered them right away, and I still have mine. It was my first set of creds,
Oh my gosh, that's hilarious.
Yeah, I didn't have a badge number, but I did have files on some people in my neighborhood.
I think I had a paper badge.
That's awesome. So, it was always kind of in our blood, yours and mine, to go into law enforcement. So but after you were the secretary there as a young person, you eventually came on as a wildlife inspector, right?
Yes. So that secretary position was just a temporary position. And I stayed on for about 11 months. And then I started applying for permanent positions. And I got hired out here in Los Angeles as a wildlife inspector in 1993.
We've talked about wildlife inspectors on this show just briefly before, but since you were one, kind of explain for our listeners what a wildlife inspector is. So in the Office of Law Enforcement, we have special agents and we have wildlife inspectors. So what does a wildlife inspector do, and what's the difference between them and a special agent?
So the wildlife inspectors are the uniformed portion of Office of Law Enforcement, and they are tasked to enforce wildlife laws, international wildlife laws, and inspect shipments, live, product, whatever, of wildlife coming in and out of the United States. So they are stationed at all ports of entry around the U.S. and look for both declared wildlife inspections to make sure that all the paperwork is accurate, but also are looking for smuggled wildlife,
right,
or illegal contraband wildlife,
right.
And then, of course, the agents are the non-uniformed officers and conduct investigations and conduct arrests and search warrants and
right. Yeah, and the inspectors are not armed; they don't have arrest authority, and their scope of their job is limited to those ports of entry you mentioned. So
correct.
They might be at the border, or at the seaport, or the airport, or the mail facility, but they're not out and about like agents are trying to investigate crimes. Yeah. So you within that job, so you were sent to L.A. as an inspector first, right?
Yes.
And then, but you have a unique kind of cred to your career, and that is you ended up becoming the very first wildlife inspector to run a canine detection unit team, right? You were the first and the only canine detection wildlife inspector in the Fish and Wildlife Service. What year was that?
That was 1996, I believe. And I came to LA and I spent a few years in LA as an inspector, and then I transferred down to the border, San Diego, and worked down there for several years. And then while I was down there, we created this program, and I I was the first canine handler for law enforcement. But refuges actually did have one canine unit ahead of us. But for law enforcement, yes, I was the very first one.
Okay. And when Erin's talking about refuges, she's talking about the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service refuge system, which basically is kind of land areas set aside as wildlife refuges, similar to a national park or it's public land, but it's set aside for wildlife, and they do have their own uniformed patrol officers that work those properties.
Yes.
So that must have been crazy to like start a program from nothing and get it going.
Yeah, it was a lot of work actually. And, I credit my supervisor at the time, Larry Farrington, for letting us run with this idea. My coworkers down in San Diego, the three of us worked together tirelessly trying to create this program and to sell it to our management, our upper management. And we started off working with search and rescue ladies, handlers, and then eventually trying to show that their dogs could be trained to detect wildlife.
Interesting.
Live and product. And so eventually I got my own dog and actually went to training and trained this dog how to detect different kinds of wildlife.
That's amazing. I remember, I still have a picture of Mason. Mason was your dog. I have a picture of Mason actually on my refrigerator in my house. So.
Oh, yes.
My
first baby.
Yeah, that's right. What was Mason trained to detect? What kind of wildlife? Do you remember?
Yes. He was trained to detect live birds because we worked primarily down at the border.
Right.
And so we had a lot of bird smuggling coming in, parrot smuggling coming in from Mexico.
Right.
He was trained to find live reptiles because we also got a lot of that down on the border. And then we trained him on bear bile.
Interesting.
Yes, bear gallbladder bile. Okay. Because we were at a lot of the other ports of entry, San Francisco, LA, we were having some issues with people smuggling bear gallbladders into the United States. So,
as you know, so much of wildlife trafficking is kind of cyclical, and it goes in fits and spurts, and it changes over time, right? So I remember, in the late 90s, early 2000s, there's a lot of parrots coming across the border from Mexico being smuggled.
Yeah.
And then we did a lot of enforcement work, and that kind of went away for a while.
Yes.
And then other things pick up, reptiles or sea cucumbers or whatever. And then we take law enforcement action and we kind of tamp it down. And a dog is just, a canine detection is just so valuable for law enforcement. You can't even really articulate how valuable it is, even if the dog's not finding something. Just the fact that somebody sees a wildlife inspector running a dog on a line of cars at the border, that's a huge deterrent, right? Because the public doesn't know what that dog's trained to detect and how good it is or how bad it is, right?
Yeah.
So there's the finding stuff is valuable, but also just the presence of that dog in view of the public is huge, right?
For sure. And I remember my trainer telling me, you can train a dog to find paper clips if that's what you want your dog to find.
Right.
So you can, the sky's the limit on what you could train them to be looking for. Whatever the current wildlife smuggling trend is, you could train your dog to find it.
And you can change the training over time, right? If a new species is being smuggled, you could have trained a Mason to detect a certain different animal, right? If you wanted to, if you needed to,
sure.
He could be trained.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the cool thing about this, you being the pioneer in this program, there is now an established canine detection program throughout the Fish and Wildlife Service. I don't know how many dogs the service has now, but it's at least half a dozen probably.
Yeah.
And they have full-time wildlife inspector canine units, and that is all because of you pioneering that program. So super cool. It took a while to get it going.
Yeah.
And Fish and Wildlife stumbled a little bit in implementing it and making it effective.
There was kind of a gap between when I got hired as a special agent and I had to give up my canine. There were a few years, but the service picked it up
Yeah.
a few years later, and it's alive and well today.
Yeah, and we'll come back to the K-9 program a little bit, because one of the first dogs after yours, when the program was initiated nationwide, LA, Los Angeles was one of the first places that got a dog, and by that time you were the supervisor in LA. So we'll come back to that in a second.
Sure.
But so now you mentioned you became an agent at some point. So you transitioned from being a uniformed wildlife inspector now to being a gun carrying arrest authority special agent. What year was that?
2001.
Yeah. That was the year before I got hired. So
Yes.
shortly after you became an agent, and you were sent to LA, right?
Yep.
Yep. I arrived in LA about a year later, and my first impression, so you and I think we share a mentor.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, Marie Palladini is your mentor, I assume, right?
For sure.
Yeah, for sure.
She was amazing.
Mine too. Yeah.
Still is.
Still is. Always was. And so we were both kind of working with Marie and being supervised by Marie and trained by Marie. So you and I became fast friends. But what I remember coming into the office was I looked around at all the agents in the office. We were fully staffed when I arrived in 2003. You had been there about a year after coming out of training, and everybody was killing it. Do you remember that? I mean,
Yeah, we were busy.
we were busy. I felt like every week we were doing a search warrant or an arrest warrant or some type of massive surveillance operation that involved pretty much all of us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The good old days.
The good old days. And I remember looking around and you and Neil Mendelson, all the agents, and Bruce Toloski, and just being like, how the hell am I going to meet this bar that these people are setting? And one instance in particular, you took me to the airport. I was brand new. I don't know what you were doing out there, but you took me out to the airport to go do something related. I think it was a bear bile case, actually, that you were working on. And I can't really explain it, but I watched you, and just the way you had only been on a year, and you were just working so fluidly with U.S. Customs and Border Protection, making your way through security at the airport, knowing exactly where to go and what to look at. I thought, God, holy shit, I'm never going to be able to do this job. It was impressive.
That was all a facade, Ed, because I had no idea what I was doing.
Well, you definitely faked it well. So the big question I have for you, since Marie is your mentor and my mentor, between the two of us, who do you think's her favorite?
Who do you think
is Marie's favorite?
Oh, me, for sure.
Oh, good. That's the right answer.
No, I don't know. I don't think she has a favorite.
Oh, yeah. No.
She likes us both the same.
Okay, that's a better answer. All right, so you became an agent, and that leads us into, actually what I want to talk about next, I think, is we'll come back to the case that we're going to talk about today. But after being an agent in LA, when Marie Palladini retired, you ended up becoming the resident agent in charge for Southern California. You basically took over her role.
Yeah.
That must have been crazy.
It was big shoes to fill.
Yeah, because, I mean, what we're talking about is not just the supervisor of the LA office. You were the agent in charge of all of our law enforcement operations in Southern California. So that's basically Kern County south to the border of Mexico, and then east to the border of with Arizona and Nevada, right? Yeah.
Yeah, it was an overwhelming position when I took over. I was pretty young in my career, honestly. If I could go back, I probably would have waited a bit to go into that type of position. The fun times were investigating,
Totally.
doing those cases and being out in the field. And it was a huge territory to supervise and a large office of inspectors, administrative staff, and agents.
Yeah.
We had the, LAX airport. We had the largest border down in San Diego, Mexico border, all those ports of entry. It was busy.
Yeah. Plus the field office in San Diego, right?
Correct.
Where we have special agents and wildlife inspectors as well.
Yes.
That border you mentioned, it's 140 miles of border between California and Mexico. And I forget how many border crossings are in there. It's 3, 4?
There's 5.
5, okay.
Yeah.
So that's a huge responsibility. Tons of illegal wildlife coming across from Mexico into the U.S., all kinds, right? Fish. You even intercepted a tiger cub at one point coming across the border there. I mean, your agents did. Yeah.
Yes. Yep.
And then we're also talking about an area with 23 plus million people in it, and the largest county in the United States, the largest seaport in the United States. So huge responsibility. What was like the most rewarding aspect? So how long were you the RAC, the resident agent in charge?
14 years.
14 years.
Yeah.
This is the most rewarding. Do you have anything that jumps out at you as being like the most rewarding aspect of being a supervisor?
Honestly, we were joking about me being interviewed and not really enjoying that.
Yeah.
But I feel like we kind of put LA on the map.
Yeah.
Because we did do a lot of media. We did do a lot of interviews and getting our word out. And I really felt like that was an important part of my job. Even though I didn't really, enjoy the interview and whatnot, but it was pretty important to talk about our cases. And, all of that comes with funding and awareness and deterrence and all of that. So,
yeah, I mean, at its core, the American people are our taxpayers. They pay our salary. We do work for them. They need to know what we do, right? There's that.
Yeah.
And then the more information you get out about how good your agents are and how good they do their job, the more that deters people from potentially committing crime who might have been leaning that way, right?
Yeah.
I think a lot of times with other people within the Fish and Wildlife Service, particularly some people at headquarters, who I'm talking about, never understood why LA did get in the media as much as it did. And it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that, number one, Los Angeles, Southern California, for the Fish and Wildlife Service, always been one of the busiest field offices in the country. Maria and I talked about that during her episode. And the other thing is, this is the media capital of the world, right?
Yeah.
So the U.S. Attorney puts out a press release about any animal case. Every news agency in Los Angeles picks it up, and when they pick it up, news agencies across the U.S. pick it up. So there's a huge opportunity to get the word out that you very smartly capitalized on, and you weren't afraid to talk to the media, even though you didn't like it.
Yeah. Yeah.
The other thing you did too, as the resident agent in charge, you made sure, and part of the reason I know this so well is because about a year after you became the resident agent in charge, you hired me to be your deputy. And there were, I think, 3 areas of the country that had deputy resident agents in charge. One was LA, New York, and Miami, or the Florida area there. So I knew, I worked with you as a deputy for 7.5 years, and I knew how you operated and what you were doing and what your philosophy was. And the other thing you did, you made sure we were very relevant in the law enforcement community in Southern California. Like, you always had us at what were called the head fed meetings.
Yep.
Those were quarterly, I think, right?
I believe so.
Yeah. And that was run by the United States Attorney for the Central District of California. And it was every law enforcement agency in the metro, area attended those. And so we were there along with DEA, FBI, Secret Service. It made us, put us in front of the U.S. Attorney's Office, kept us very relevant. And that's all you.
I was just going to say that. It was, it kept us in touch with all the different agencies. Right. Being such a small agency, we needed help, out on surveillance, arrests, search warrants and stuff like that. And, it's really about networking, even in law enforcement.
Right.
And so I felt like that was a very important part of my job too, is to keep U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service relevant to these other agencies. And, sometimes they'd crack jokes and, but I'd always go back, especially when we charged a case and it was splashed all over the news. I mean, people are just fascinated with our cases. There's just no doubt about that.
Yep.
and the U.S. Attorney's Office knew that, and so they capitalized on that, and it was good for us, I felt.
Yeah, I agreed with you, especially as your deputy, of course. It's funny you say that too, because I remember, I don't remember where I was, but there was some meeting I was going to attend, and it hadn't started yet, and somebody else, the FBI or somebody, wanted to get the meeting going, and a HSI agent told him, no, you have to wait till the fish cops get here. It's always some joke about us being the fish cops, or the,
for sure,
secret squirrels, or whatever they called us. And that's good to talk about that the importance of networking with other law enforcement agencies, not just the state agencies like the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, but also all of our partner federal agencies. And the case I want to talk to you about that you worked on when you were an agent is kind of a perfect example of that, and also a very interesting example of how wildlife crime often overlaps with other crimes, right? You hear about it a lot.
Yeah.
Like you hear this, people say that, but you don't see a lot of examples of it. And the case you're going to talk about today is a classic example of a person involved in wildlife crime, but also involved in other really serious crimes. And the reason for that is because the person's a criminal, right?
Yeah.
They just out to make money. They don't love animals. They aren't some sort of animal lover who got a little carried away. They're a crook. They're a criminal. And so, of course, they're going to be involved in wildlife crime and drugs or anything else, right?
Whenever I would go out and give a presentation trying to explain what we did, I always gave the example, we're just like FBI agents, we're just like DEA agents, but you just switch that commodity from drugs, weapons, illegal immigration to wildlife.
Yeah.
And it's about money.
It's about money. And in the end, it's about money and criminal activity. And so many of these people, as you know, when they get in front of a judge, they portray themselves as someone who really cares about wildlife. And sometimes they even try to say that what they were doing was trying to propagate wildlife or somehow pervertedly save wildlife. And unfortunately, sometimes judges fall for those stories, right? But they're just crooks.
Yeah.
So we're going to, as a caveat, let me just warn our listeners that we're going to refer to this criminal today by his first name, only Craig. We're not going to say the last name because this person, although was convicted, this is not a person now that you and I are both retired, we don't carry guns every day. We don't want this person targeting anybody in this case, right? Whether it's us or informants. So we're not going to divulge the identity of informants, and we're just going to refer to this person as Craig today. And if we let the last name slip, we're going to bleep it out. So if you hear a bleep, that's what that's about.
That's what happened.
Yeah, exactly. So tell us about this case involving Craig. My understanding is this case has actually started. The state was investigating Craig. So the state of California Department of Fish and Wildlife. What were they looking at Craig for, and then how did you get hooked into this whole thing?
I believe they were looking at Craig for the collection of illegal wildlife in California waters.
Like state wildlife. Mm-hmm. So he was after fish.
Yes.
Okay.
I believe that's what they were looking at him for.
Okay. Because I remember this, we were both new agents. You were working on this. I didn't, for whatever reason, I don't know why I didn't get involved in helping you on this case, but maybe I was busy with my own stuff. I don't know. But I remember there was a game warden who was doing a lot of surveillance.
Yes.
Rebecca Hartman, right?
Yes.
And you would kind of help her out with that, right?
Oh, yes. That's how we really got to know each other. We had met at the range, the qualifying shooting range.
Firearm range.
Firearms. And we would sometimes go with California Fish and Wildlife wardens to qualify. And she was working this case and with this guy involving Craig. Mm-hmm. And his business happened to be very close to our office in Torrance. And so, I'd be working away at the office doing something, and I'd get a call from Rebecca. Hey, I've been doing surveillance for hours. Is there any way you can come and relieve me just for a little bit so I could take a break?
In other words, I got to go to the bathroom.
Yes. And so I'd, race over there, and, we'd switch out cars, and I'd sit there and watch for her for a bit until she had a little time to go break and come back.
Nice. So. But at this point, it's not a federal case, right? It's a state investigation.
No, it was just he was a licensed importer, exporter. So we knew who he was, certainly.
Right.
But we were not looking at him for any federal violations.
Yeah. And again, for background, the crazy thing about working on wildlife criminal investigations is that it is legal to import and export wildlife. It happens all the time, every day. I mean, I think the public would be astonished to know how much live wildlife is legally imported into the United States just through the Los Angeles International Airport. It's crazy.
That was always pretty shocking to me.
Super shocking, especially fish, aquatic animals in particular. It's by the millions every year. So it can be done legally, and there are legal importers and exporters, and that makes criminal investigations sometimes extremely challenging because, of course, the best way to smuggle is to hide it in plain sight and make it look like a legal shipment, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay, so Craig was a licensed importer, exporter, but at this point it's a state investigation. How did it make the transition to become a federal investigation where you kind of took the lead?
Well, to kind of go back just a little bit, I remember hearing on the news about a yacht that was carrying 50 illegal immigrants from Mexico that was apprehended by Coast Guard in the LA harbor.
Okay.
And I remember hearing that on the news. Of course, had no connections whatsoever to anything I was doing. Yeah. But it was a lot because, 50 people in I think it was like a 44-foot yacht. I remember there was a pregnant woman, a 3-year-old kid. That was kind of a big story.
Yeah, right.
On the news. And so I remember hearing about that, but I was honestly just at the office one day, and somebody came in to the front window and said, "Can I talk to somebody about Craig?"
Interesting.
And that's how it all started.
So an informant just basically walked in and offered to give information.
Yeah.
And it was related to did it turn out it was related to this yacht?
So, yes.
Okay. This is one reason why it's so critical. When I was an agent, you were an agent, I always took those phone calls from the public, and I always talked to those people who walked in the front door.
Yeah.
Because, 9 times out of 10, they're there to talk to you about nothing. But that one time.
Well, this guy was a gold mine.
Nice.
I mean, he had a lot of information about Craig and what he was doing, and basically was, asking for help. He's like, this guy is crazy.
Interesting.
And he's doing a lot of illegal activity, and I know it's not right, and I don't want to get caught up in it, and can you help me? And so ended up signing him up as an informant. And
what was his motivation, though? Was it just to, we don't want to give away who the informant was, but were they more concerned with Craig's committing illegal acts and I don't like it, or were they afraid they were going to get tangled up in it somehow?
I don't know for sure, but honestly, out of all my years of investigating and dealing with informants, and this guy was just a genuinely good guy.
Okay. They're the best kind of informant, the one who does it
the best I ever dealt with.
If they do it out of like the goodness of their heart, that's a good informant, usually.
He wasn't a criminal.
Yeah.
He did what I asked him to do. He reported back to me when I asked him to. I mean, he was a dream informant.
And that's unusual. That's the exception, not the rule. Most
very
informants
unusual.
are very difficult to deal with.
Very unusual.
Okay, so what else did he tell you about Craig?
Well, that he basically was involved in a lot of illegal activity, everything from smuggling illegal fish into the United States. This guy was caught up in cocaine smuggling, marijuana smuggling, illegal immigrants smuggling.
Wow. So true crossover. He's just involved in criminal activity, period. For the money.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so drugs, people, and fish. And that's, I guess, the fish part is why he chose to walk into a Fish and Wildlife Service law enforcement office, right?
Yeah, it was kind of funny because he came to Fish and Wildlife, we owned the case.
Right.
Which was amazing.
Right.
Because, and you've probably heard me talk about, we were working this with Homeland Security investigations.
You brought in Homeland Security after you got this tip?
Yeah, because it just involved so much.
Yeah, drugs and people, that'd be the agency, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And the agent that was assigned to co-investigate with me was literally an absolute boob. I mean, and I started thinking about this.
That happens too, right?
Oh my gosh. He would show up at our meetings and all disheveled and like, I think he had a drinking problem.
Oh boy.
And one day he came and showed up and he was like, had a black eye and he had gotten in a fight at a concert or something that he attended. And I was just like, oh my gosh.
That's classic.
Yeah. And so probably because it involved fish, probably their agency was like, oh, let's just give this to this guy and whatever.
You know how I love 1970s police procedurals like Adam 12 and Dragnet, right?
Yeah.
I nerd out over those shows.
Yes.
There's a classic line from one of the old Dragnets where Joe Friday, he likes to give a lot of exposition in his dialogue, and he says something like, the number one problem with law enforcement officers is they're human, right? So just like any other profession, I don't know, I always put it at about 10%. I don't care where you work, if you work at a law firm or you work at Costco, about 10% of the employees are going to be boobs.
Yeah.
Right? And you're kind of like, what? How do they even function?
Yeah.
That's true for law enforcement too. We get, we try to pick and choose the best of the best, but some boobs get through.
Yeah.
Sometimes they become boobs later in their career.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So
I think eventually this guy was either asked to resign or got fired. I'm not sure, but I ended up doing most of the investigative work on the case.
on all of it, the drugs, the people, and
I think after he placed a tracking device on Craig's car, and Craig walked out the next morning and saw the wires sticking up out of the hood of the car, I think that's when finally they were like, okay, this is bad.
Boy, that's hilarious. I don't think I knew that part of the story. That is hilarious.
Yeah.
Did Craig take the tracker off the car?
Yes.
And that's the most amazing thing. Now, Craig, who by all, all evidence is a pretty good criminal.
Yeah.
He sees that there's a tracker on his car. He takes it off. He destroys it. But that did not necessarily deter him from continuing to be a criminal.
Oh, no.
It's amazing how brazen they are. They know they're being watched.
Well, they're greedy.
They're greedy. That's the bottom line.
They want money.
Exactly. So what was the fish? We've said fish, but what was it?
They were called Clarion angelfish, and they were found down in the waters, Mexican waters, and Mexico protected them and didn't allow fishing, collecting of them, and certainly didn't allow exporting them to anywhere, other countries.
So Craig's bringing these Clarion angelfish up alive for the pet trade, I assume.
Very expensive aquarium fish. Yeah, at the time, probably about $2,000 a piece.
Oof.
For a aquarium fish. Yeah.
I'll put a picture of a Clarion angelfish on the Nature's Secret Service website, but they're crazy. There is I don't know if it's Clarion angelfish or not, but there is a species of angelfish that's found off the coast of California too. Is it Clarions or no? It's a different subspecies. Or something.
Yes, and I can't remember
it either.
And this is terrible. This shows how old we're getting, but yes.
But they're kind of like visually, when you see one, it kind of throws you because they look like a giant goldfish in the ocean, and it kind of your brain kind of has to adjust for a second and be like, why is there a goldfish in the ocean, right?
Yeah.
They're cool looking fish.
Yeah. They're pretty. The Clarion angelfish are really pretty fish.
And that's the insidious side of the aquarium trade, is that all saltwater fish and corals are hard to keep alive, of course. And so this ends up becoming just a revolving door of once you introduce Clarion angelfish into the market, they become popular. Other people see them and they want them. They're not going to stay alive very long because they're hard to keep alive.
Yeah.
Anybody who ever's had a saltwater tank knows how difficult it is. And so then there's demand for more and more and more fish, right? It's a really insidious trade.
Well, and these were just so rare.
Yeah.
And that's what people were after. Nobody could get them. And so when they were available, people were willing to pay a lot of money for them.
Do you remember how many he brought across?
I was able to track about 160 that we caught.
So a lot of money too.
Yeah. About $360,000, I think, is what we valued the shipment.
And that's just what you found?
That's just what we found.
So who knows how many others?
Yeah, and I'm quite certain there were other shipments that we didn't find.
Okay.
But
so, and just so everybody's aware, obviously we know why it's illegal to bring drugs and people into the country. But with regard to those fish, if they're protected by Mexican law and then they're brought into the United States, or in other words, if they're collected in violation of Mexican law and brought into the U.S., you were essentially doing a Lacey Act investigation, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Smuggling, Lacey Act.
Smuggling and Lacey Act, right? Because he wouldn't declare them, so that's a smuggling.
Yep.
Both felonies, smuggling and Lacey Act are both felonies.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Cool. So
Yeah.
you're off and running, and aside from your partner at HSI who leaves something to be desired, you're on to something good.
Yeah.
What'd you do? How'd you pursue the investigation?
So a lot of it was going and interviewing, getting pieces of information from the informant, going to conduct interviews, trying to validate the information that he was giving me, looking at documents, going to interview other importers who had purchased them,
Right.
Even some overseas people that Craig had shipped them to in Japan and Hong Kong.
Okay, so he'd sneak them into the U.S., and then from the U.S. he would smuggle them again out to other countries in Asia.
Yes.
Wow.
Yep. Okay. Meanwhile, doing all of this other illegal activity, as it turns out, the yacht all of that was coordinated by Craig. He hired 2 individuals to drive the yacht. They'd rent the yacht here in the U.S. and they'd drive it down to Ensenada. Craig would arrange all of that. He'd pile on the people on the yacht. They'd drive it back up. Craig would drive through the border, meet them back up in L.A., and direct them where to go and to, where it was safe to unload and where they wouldn't get caught. And then people would jump off of this boat. And I believe there were 4 instances at least of this.
Interesting.
And that was all based on the individuals that we interviewed that were driving the boat.
Oh, so you actually tracked down who he hired to drive the boat?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. They were caught.
Okay. Yeah, and that Coast Guard caught them.
On that 50-person load. Mm-hmm. And so then we were working with those guys, and they were charged, of course, and convicted, but they also cooperated and gave us some information on Craig. So, it was crazy. And then, unbeknownst to me, DEA was involved even before I got involved, and had conducted a search warrant on his house. They had seized expensive watches. I think there were some Rolex watches, a bunch of evidence, money. I think they seized some duffel bags that had marijuana residue. Wow. And I don't know why he was never charged criminally for drug smuggling, but we had a lot of information. He owned an RV. Uh-huh. And so we also think that on those yachts coming in, that there were drugs,
Right.
fish, and people.
Interesting.
And he would then take this RV, load it up, and drive it all across the country and drop off his loads.
Wow. So not just he was an organizer, but also distributor and very intimately involved in this business.
Yeah. This guy had a rap sheet a mile long.
No kidding.
He had a lot going on.
And, it kind of brings me back to, the efforts you took as a RAC to make sure that Fish and Wildlife Services dialed in with other agencies. This illustrates, I think, how agencies can kind of get into, I hate to use the word silos because it's so overused now, but they do kind of get into this is our mission and we don't see beyond our mission, right? So like when Coast Guard stopped this boat the first time, the fish were on the boat, right? 100 plus fish.
We didn't get any fish on that boat.
Oh, okay. So Coast Guard wouldn't have necessarily thought to reach out to
Right.
Fish and Wildlife because there was no fish on that boat.
Right.
How did you know that fish were coming across
Based
in
on
system?
interviews and stuff.
After the fact. Mm-hmm. And the informant came in to tell you too,
Yep.
right? Okay, interesting. So Coast Guard DEA wouldn't have necessarily had anything from that load that alerted them, hey, Fish and Wildlife ought to be looped in on this, right?
Right.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah, that was strictly just
So Coast Guard probably notified DEA that they got a shitload of drugs.
Yeah.
And that started that, but nobody saw fish at that point.
correct.
Got it. Okay. So then, so this is interesting. As a investigator, you get this informant comes in, tells you this story. How long did it take you to connect it to that boat you had seen on the news?
Well, pretty quickly.
Okay.
Yeah, because, the information that the informant was giving me, we knew that Craig was the one responsible for coordinating those
Got it.
trips.
Okay.
Yeah, so it was pretty.
So you put that together that it was this boat you'd seen on the news was a Craig boat.
Yeah.
Okay. And then so the informant then told you he was bringing in the Clarion angelfish?
Yes.
Okay.
And so that was through declared shipments. I told you he was a licensed importer.
Right.
And so he was bringing in shipments of legal stuff, but then threw in these Clarion angelfish as well on the angelfish
Right.
portion of the case. We also got information that he was throwing them on the yachts as an afterthought.
Right.
Oh, here's another good way to make some extra money. Let's just throw those on the boat as well.
Okay, so he had multiple methods. He would do it on the boat with the drugs and the people, but also just ship them over. What would he do? Misdeclare them or just hide them among other fish?
He hid them amongst other declared fish. So amongst legal stuff.
Mm-hmm. Going back to what we talked about at the beginning with the importance of the wildlife inspector's job, right?
Yeah.
They're going to be cracking open these boxes, these shipments of legal, and they're going to be comparing the paperwork declaration to what they see in the box. So they have to be able to know what the species are they're looking at in that box. Not always easy.
Yeah, and again, we talked about how much stuff comes in.
Yeah.
And it's just, honestly, I hate to say it, but sometimes you're just lucky.
Yeah.
You happen to open the right box and boom, there's something there that wasn't on the paperwork.
Right.
So, sometimes it's like finding a needle in the haystack.
It is, but it's also about intelligent enforcement and inspection work. I'm not going to give away the detail on this, but you remember we worked on a coral case together for a while, and we actually came up with a way to look at shipments and figure out whether they were suspicious or not. And I'm not going to give any more detail, but we kind of hedged our bets as to which shipments to do full inspections on, because we figured out a way to identify shipments just based on the paperwork about what was likely to have contraband in it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's all about intelligent and using intelligence and to make smart choices about what you look at.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. I do, now that we talk about this, I do remember going with you to a few of these fish importers to look at paperwork. Mm-hmm. That was incredibly dull.
Yeah. Yeah, not fun.
Wasn't it, to do those interviews? I was always your second, so I didn't have to interview these people. I was just there to take notes.
Yeah.
But I do remember going with you down near LAX to some of these places. It had to be the Clarion angelfish case.
Yeah.
But
I'm sure it was.
Yeah.
Because a lot of it was paperwork, a paperwork trail.
So how do you prove? So you go back now and how did you find the Clarion angelfish? Did you find them in his warehouse, or where were they?
He distributed them. I can't even say that. He distributed them so quickly after he got them.
Right.
And that's what the case was. A lot of just going back and tracking and where did they go and who bought them and who sold them. And so I was going to all these different places and seizing all of these fish that these importers bought. And, a lot of the wholesalers that purchased from him, they were like, well, Craig had them, and so I'm just going to purchase them, and thought they were off the hook.
And I'm sure he told them that they were legal, probably, and they just accepted it. Right?
Yeah. So I was seizing, all of these Clarion angelfish all over LA that I could find. Some of them were in the Midwest already.
Wow.
Some were in New York already.
Wow.
Like I say, Japan, Hong Kong. So it was pretty.
I assume those were hard. Those were impossible to reach, the overseas ones. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
impossible.
Then how do you? How do you find that fish? So this is what, even today, I was an agent for 20 years. That is a puzzle, right?
Yeah.
So you have this tip. How did you find your first fish? Do you remember the first live fish at a customer?
I remember. And this is strange, that I remember back in our warehouse, and I was just looking through some of the paperwork. And again, I think it was something to do with the information that the informant gave me. And I was just looking through all the paperwork and what they were declared as and what they actually were, and trying to piece that together with who may have purchased them from Craig. And
so you're just kind of looking for suspicious sales that didn't quite look right, based on looking at manifests from declared shipments versus sales, that kind of thing?
I think that's how I did it.
Holy cow.
Trying to weed through all that paperwork and then figure out who had what, and then the information from the informant about who was purchasing them, and then just going to their businesses and talking to them and having them show me the fish, and then ending up seizing them.
Yoink.
Yep. Thank you very much.
What was the reaction when you would seize fish from people? Were they pissed, or did they kind of understand?
Some of them were super pissed off, of course, because they paid a lot of money.
Dollars, yeah.
And then, the whole deal where I thought it was fine, Craig had him and he sold him to me, and, but some of them were pretty smart people that probably knew more about that industry than any of us. And I was like, come on, really? You thought this was okay?
Right.
So.
Did any of those people get charged, or just take the fish from them and you called that good?
Yeah, I think we ended up.
Pretty good punishment, actually. They're out the money.
Yeah, we didn't charge anybody else. But in the case, of course, the driver of the yachts, they were charged and convicted.
Well, let me stop you there.
Okay.
So, next question is, you've gone through the paperwork, you've recovered some fish. Where'd those fish go? Remember?
Yes. We donated them to the Aquarium of the Pacific.
Nice. So you found a home for them. And I think a lot of people listening will probably say, how come you can't send them back to Mexico? There's a reason for that. And it's often very difficult to do what we call repatriate wild animals back to where they came from. Do you want to explain it? Why they can't go back often? Sometimes they can, but rarely.
Sometimes they can. I mean, that's always our goal. And according to the convention, that is actually what we are supposed to do.
Right, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species.
Correct.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of, factors to that, dealing with different international countries, paperwork, disease factor. They don't necessarily want to take back wildlife where they don't know where it's been, what it's been exposed to.
Yep.
So it's a lot of red tape.
That's a fundamental problem with repatriating wildlife is that you're relying on the bad guy telling you where they came from, right? Often that's that's it, right?
Yeah.
And that's a person who's a liar and has an incentive to lie. So the country that the animals came from, it's often them that will not take the animals back because they cannot be assured that they know where to put the animals back into the wild. And if they were just to put them back anywhere, it could cause disruptions by introducing disease or a parasite that was not existent in that population of fish before, right?
Yeah.
So
biologists really have a hard time with it sometimes.
Yeah, understandably, right? I mean, if the only times I've ever seen repatriation work is when you know for sure that this is where the animals came from, and there's a really good history of what they were exposed to in transit and in between, right? I think in my career I saw it maybe only once or twice that animals were repatriated.
Not very many times. I did some birds one time.
Right. It's rare.
I can't think. Yeah, it's very, very rare.
And the other aspect too, of course, is there's in the back of your mind, you're always worried a little bit about corruption somewhere in the chain, and you don't want these animals to get back into the
trade.
The illegal trade. So yeah, there's that concern, not just with U.S. officials, but foreign officials as well are worried about corruption as well, and they don't want those animals to get back into the trade. That's tough. Okay, so you've got some fish back. You found a home for them. They're going to live and they're going to be safe. How'd you like organize your charges? Who's going to get charged, and who do you talk to about getting these people charged?
So, luckily for me, I took this case up to the U.S. Attorney's Office, and a wonderful prosecutor up there, probably the best that I ever worked with, William Carter.
One of the best.
One of the best, yes. And he took this case, and I think he was pretty interested in all of the facets of what this guy was doing.
Right. He saw that it was some true criminal involved in crimes, all kinds of crimes, right?
Yes.
Right.
But Bill worked in the environmental crimes section at the U.S. Attorney's Office. But I think because of that HSI investigation and that agent that was working, Bill took it all on.
He did the whole deal, the wildlife, the drugs, the people, all of it.
He did the wildlife and the illegal immigration.
Oh, they never charged for the drugs for whatever reason?
The drugs were never
Interesting. Okay.
solidified.
Okay.
Yeah, at least criminally.
Yeah.
So Bill was the one that ended up indicting Craig on 7 charges of smuggling and Lacey Act, I believe.
Wow.
And lo and behold, while we were doing all of this, Craig was arrested by the state. And
by California Department of Fish and Wildlife?
Yes, I believe so.
for their case?
Yes.
Oh, crazy.
So Craig was in jail, which gave us a little bit of extra time to, dot our I's and cross our T's with our investigation and that illegal immigration case. And Bill ended up charging Craig on that one as well.
Oh.
Yeah.
On what one? The illegal?
The 50 the
50 people
that were
illegal immigration.
The 50 load.
Awesome. So you went to federal grand jury, and got a 7-count indictment on him for the Clarion angelfish and the people.
Yes.
We were so lucky in our careers because the whole time we were agents, the United States Attorney's Office. So listeners understand, you always hear about the U.S. Department of Justice, right? And there are U.S. DOJ, as you know, Erin, prosecutors in Washington, D.C., and there is an environmental crimes section there at DOJ in Washington, D.C. But around the country, there are individual United States attorneys who have districts, and they're part of DOJ, but they're really responsible for their districts. And in Los Angeles, there's the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Central District of California. And our whole careers, they always had their own independent environmental crimes section. And that's not true for most U.S. attorneys' offices around the country. There's a few that have dedicated environmental crimes prosecutors, but not many.
Right.
So we were lucky because we could go directly to our own. We didn't have to compete with the FBI or HSI or ATF or U.S. Marshals for attention with the U.S. attorney, we could go directly to the
We had our
crimes.
own.
We had our own.
Yeah.
Yeah. And Bill Carter was one of my favorites too, in part because I used to love it when you'd go into Bill Carter's office and you'd brief him about a case. And the first things he'd say were like, sounds good, let's arrest him. I loved it when he would say that, because sometimes U.S. attorneys, as you know, are kind of reluctant to make, probable cause arrests or file a complaint and make an arrest. They want to charge them and have them, notified by mail and brought in. I always hated that. I like to hook people up, and as you and I have said many times, that first 24 hours in jail that they do is probably the worst.
Yes, yes.
And that's a lesson they can learn, right? It's a
Good
deliverable.
deterrent.
That's a good deterrent. And Bill was always on board. If you had a felony that you brought him, he pretty much was on board with making an arrest pretty quick.
Yeah, he was awesome.
But you didn't have to arrest Craig because he was
No.
already in custody.
He was already in custody, so that made it a little bit easier on us, for sure.
And what happened? Did he go to trial, or what? Did he plead guilty? How did it play out?
He pled guilty. Yep, he pled guilty, and he was sentenced to 46 months.
Wow, that's a good one.
Which is pretty good for wildlife crime.
That's huge.
Yeah, so a little under 4 years.
Yeah, if we can actually put people in jail for more than a year based on a wildlife crime, that's pretty darn good. 46 months is definitely one of the higher ones I've heard of.
Yeah.
That must have been pretty cool.
That was exciting. Yeah.
Early in your career, get that knocked out.
Yep. He had to pay $60,000 penalty as well. Oh, that was good. It was a good little case.
Yeah, that's a great case. I love it. And deterrent, right?
Yeah.
And, one of the reasons we're not mentioning Craig's last name here is because later, after he finished his federal time, he actually did some more state time for some type of murder, right?
Oh, I
second-degree
recall
murder.
in the sentencing hearing that he said something as he was pleading with the judge to give him a lesser sentence. He said, he was so sorry and that he would never commit a crime again. And then a few years later, he gets charged with involuntary manslaughter.
Oh, that's what it was, involuntary manslaughter, yeah.
Yeah, for a diving incident off of Catalina Island.
Not good.
Not good. Sad.
And somewhere in your case, too, there was some issue involving either a witness or somebody got beat up, right? Mysteriously beat up, that we don't know who or why or how.
So our informant was going home one evening, and just out of nowhere, I think it was two guys just pummeled him.
For no reason.
For no reason.
Didn't rob him or anything.
Didn't rob him, just beat him up at his doorstep and left him. Yeah, it was pretty scary.
Suspicious.
Yeah.
I do remember when that happened, kind of the whole office was a little bit on alert over that.
Yeah.
Because you don't know who else is going to get targeted, whether it
Takes it to a new level for sure.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. It was a little bit scary because we were dealing with a bad guy, a really bad guy. And you'd meet him and you would, he was the most charming person. You would never in a million years think of all of the terrible stuff that he had done.
Yeah, put on a good show.
Put on a really good show. But yeah, I don't doubt that he was responsible for that.
Interesting. Well, this for sure is not, the only case you ever did that was a success or of interest. But this is a cool case. This is one of those things that I remember watching and thinking, holy cow, how am I going to meet the high bar that all my colleagues are setting? To be early in your career and get a 46-month sentence, that's pretty impressive. Really, really cool, and definitely set the tone for my whole career because, as I've said before, any success I ever had in my 20 years was only because I was trying to meet the high bar of all of my colleagues around me. You, Marie, other agents around the country. I'm always just phenomenally impressed with the amount of work that you're willing to put in. You never give up. Federal agents are some of the most dogged investigators I've ever seen,
Yeah.
And it's really true what they say about federal officers and then special agents that, if you're committing a crime and one of them's on your tail, you're done. They will get you.
Yeah.
There's no question about it, right?
But it's not easy.
It's not easy. And I think that's why, special agents really are recruited and from a broad variety of backgrounds. I was talking to Keith Swindle about this in an episode, and we have biologists, we have lawyers, we have former police officers, former game wardens, all kinds of people, former wildlife inspectors. What'd you major in college?
Administration of justice.
Yeah, so the criminal justice type background, right? But we have biologists, we have people, all types of different backgrounds, and they all come to this career because they want to do this job and they care. Boy, when you turn somebody like that loose, who's well-educated, has a diverse background, well-trained at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center, if you're a crook,
watch out.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. Yeah. The last thing I want to talk to you about is this really cool thing. I don't know if you would consider it kind of like the your keystone accomplishment or not, but for years and years and years when we were agents, it wasn't just me and you. Marie talked about it. Other agents talked about it. We have this unique situation among law enforcement agencies or officers that a lot of times the wildlife or the illegal item that we seize, Clarion angelfish as an example, it's alive, right? Our evidence is often alive. Yep. And that creates huge challenges for us. I know this happened to you too. I remember one time arresting somebody at LAX for smuggling live parrots. She had 2 of them strapped to her body. I arrested her probably around 10:30, 11 at night. So my first obligation is to take her to the jail, right? And then after that, I now have to get this evidence taken care of. Yeah. But this evidence breathes, needs water, needs proper housing. It needs to be evaluated to see if it's been injured, all those things. Yeah. Now we're talking about by the time she's booked into jail, I'm back at the office at 12:30 at night trying to figure out how to care for 2 parrots. Yeah. I don't know anything about that.
And not to mention the disease factor. That you have to take into account as well, especially with birds.
Especially with birds, and more so now. Back then, that was 2011 for me. Bird flu wasn't an issue, but now if you seize a live bird off of somebody, you there's other times when we arrested people for smuggling birds coming in from Vietnam where we put on the full Tyvek suit and respirators before we search that person. Yes. Yeah, and monkeys.
Primates. Another. Yeah.
So, it's really...
only one thing worse than a bird smuggling call, and that's a primate smuggling call.
Yep, I agree 100%. Although I'm not a reptile fan, so I would put reptiles up there. I would rather handle a bird and get bitten by a bird any day than get bitten by a reptile.
Yeah.
But it's... and the reptiles can be poisonous, yeah?
Yes.
Yeah. So... this is an issue, and it's something we always talked about, is we have in Denver, the Fish and Wildlife Service has a huge facility known as the Wildlife Repository, but it's all items. It's dead animals, and the repository is where we send items we seize, and it's stored there and used either for future investigations or it's destroyed or it's kept for educational purposes. But
super easy.
Yeah. You seize something, you seize a tiger pelt, and you basically could just sign some paperwork and you FedEx it off to the Wildlife Repository in Denver, and you're good for your case. Yeah. But with live wildlife,
a little different.
Yeah, a little different. Not only are you taking care of your prisoner and dealing with all the legal requirements for getting them before a judge, but you're trying to find a place that can properly care for these exotic animals you just seized. And hugely challenging. We've always bitched about it as agents, inspectors too, been like, how come the service does not have a system for dealing with live confiscated animals? It's always just kind of, good luck, agent. Who do you know? What numbers do you have in your phone? Do you know anybody at the LA Zoo? Great, call them, right? Yeah. And so...
And not to mention the fact that, that's your evidence in your case. That's your evidence,
yep.
So you have to make sure it's all tracked properly and...
Exactly.
Chain of custody remains solid and
you can't put it in an evidence room or an evidence cage because it's alive. It has to be cared for. Often by people who are very highly trained in caring for that particular animal. So it's got to be a zoo. You can't just give it to your next door neighbor and say, hey, take care of this bird for me for the next 6 months.
Right.
So you are the only person who just decided, I'm going to tackle this problem. And when you were the resident agent in charge, and I know you're humble, so you're going to try to give credit to lots of other people, and that's a bunch of baloney. While you were the resident agent in charge in Southern California, you were like, we got to solve this problem. And you kind of pioneered this concept of developing what is it? It's the live wildlife confiscation network. Is that the right word for
Yep.
it?
That's it.
And you put together all the right stakeholders and you got them all in the right room, most of them AZA accredited zoos and other organizations that are accredited for taking care of animals. Tell us about that process. Like, how did this idea come to you, and how did the whole wildlife confiscation network get started? Because it is a thing now. It exists.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It is pretty cool.
It's very cool.
Yeah. We worked, me and another gentleman at the San Diego Zoo were the ones that spearheaded this, honestly. And we got in one room, we got the space down at the zoo, and we got everyone together in this one room, and it was pretty amazing, Ed. It was zoos, it was nonprofit organizations, it was sanctuaries, it was anyone that had a finger in live wildlife. And, sometimes these people disagree with each other in the way that they care for wildlife or what they do with it or where they take it. And so I was a little bit scared, getting all these people in one room, because I thought, fights were going to break out, not fist fights, but, I thought there was going to be some big disagreements, and quite the contrary. It was really amazing. How everybody there put aside their differences and knew that law enforcement had a problem placing these live wildlife evidence specimens, if you will.
Right.
And we came up with a plan to help agents and inspectors when they seized live animals.
That's very cool.
Yeah.
And it ended up being kind of adopted by the AZA, right? The Association of, what is it?
Zoos and Aquariums.
Zoos and Aquariums, yeah. And so it became, any AZA affiliated zoo is really kind of folded into this network, right?
Some of them.
If they want to be. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Some aren't.
Yeah, some aren't.
Yeah.
But I've heard from, agents and inspectors around the country, like in Denver, where, the Denver Zoo, I think, is part of that network now. And it's just amazing that it's not who now. There's a number. There's a mechanism for getting this done. And the AZA, I think, has even hired a coordinator for this, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep. There's a national coordinator for this. So it's really amazing. I got it kicked off, and then I retired in 2021. And then, so it was just established first in Southern California.
Right, like a trial. Yeah, yeah.
But then after I retired, it blossomed into a national program. And,
it was done. By the time you retired, it was done. It was just like the logistics of putting it into play and hiring that coordinator and doing that sort of thing. It wouldn't have happened without you, Erin. I get, you're very humble, but I'm telling you, it wouldn't have happened without you. It just wouldn't have. I don't know why, but Fish and Wildlife Service higher ups were not pushing it like you were. You knew who to put in the room. You knew how to work those sometimes conflicts between different groups or interests.
Yeah.
And, that, as far as I'm concerned, that's a huge thing. I mean, in 20 years of my career, I never had that ability. It was all just who I knew at the zoos, right? So it has a huge benefit forever on that any agent or wildlife inspector who miraculously is able to utilize this network to find a home quickly for a live animal that's an evidence item.
Yeah.
They'll never know to thank you, but they have you to thank for that. That's awesome.
Well, thanks, Ed.
Of course.
It really came to light when we seized that live tiger cub at the border.
Interesting. Okay.
That's when I was like, whoa.
That was like 2015 or 16, I think, right?
I can't remember the year, quite honestly, but it was a headache, trying to find a home for a live tiger cub. That's a big deal. You just don't take those things to anyone.
No.
And that's really, it was, I mean, I always realized it was a problem when we seized live wildlife, live cobras. Oh my gosh.
Sometimes in the more common stuff's actually harder to place, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
Right.
True.
Ball pythons and things like that.
Very true. Right. And, of course, we talked about the birds and the primates and everything. But, what I wanted to focus on was let the inspector do their work, what they are supposed to be doing by charging these people, bringing in this illegal stuff. And let's have a process where the live evidence is maintained. And if needed, it's all there.
It's all there. But the individual law enforcement officer is not bogged down with dealing with that care and that placement.
Exactly.
When they should be working on the case to charge the person, right?
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Thanks.
Yeah, really cool. Erin, I can't tell you how much I appreciate you coming on to talk to us, pushing through your being recorded.
I did it.
You did it. It's great to have you on the show. I wouldn't have done this podcast without you being one of my guests, and I'm going to twist your arm and have you back sometime.
Okay.
But thank you so much for being on and telling the great story, and great job on everything you did in your career. How many years? 29? 29 years of service to the people of the United States. Thank you. That's impressive.
Yeah. Thanks, Ed.
All right, Erin, you're one of my faves.
Oh, same.
All right, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I'm Ed Newcomer. This is Nature's Secret Service. We'll see you next time. Nature's Secret Service is written and produced by me, Ed Newcomer, and is co-produced by the DHTV team here at California State University, Dominguez Hills. Follow us on social media and connect with us online at naturesecretservice.com.